The Tulsi Gabbard and Jamie Raskin confrontation did not explode in one perfect television moment. That is part of why it matters. Some of the most important political conflicts do not happen as clean face-to-face duels. They happen when one side tries to slow the system down, insist on process, and raise warning flags before a nomination becomes power, while the other side moves through the same landscape as proof that the old gatekeepers are panicking because one of their preferred filters is failing. That is the real Raskin-Gabbard story. It is a fight about vetting, but not in the boring bureaucratic sense. It is a fight about whether the institutions of national security can still demand ordinary standards from extraordinary nominees, or whether even the language of ordinary standards has now become politically suspect in the eyes of a movement that believes the old guardians were never neutral to begin with. That is why Jamie Raskin became so relevant to Tulsi Gabbard's path. Raskin was not on the Senate Intelligence Committee conducting the confirmation hearing. He was not the senator asking each question in the room. But he was one of the clearest Democratic voices trying to frame the Gabbard nomination as a systems test rather than merely a personnel question. In December 2024, as Trump's transition team assembled controversial nominees, Raskin formally demanded assurance that every nominee would undergo a standard FBI background check and full vetting before being considered by the Senate or given access to classified information. His letter explicitly warned that several nominees appeared to have troubling ties or records, and that bypassing normal scrutiny would itself be a democratic danger. That matters because it defines the confrontation immediately. Raskin's argument was not simply, "I dislike Tulsi Gabbard." His argument was that the system exists precisely for moments like this, when a nominee's past relationships, foreign policy positions, statements, and judgment are likely to generate genuine concern. In his view, the answer to such concern was not panic or theatrical demonization. It was to insist on process strong enough to carry public trust. Gabbard's larger political meaning, however, pulled in exactly the opposite direction. For her supporters, she represented a challenge to that very trust architecture. See, she was not a safe institutional choice. She was a disruptive one. Former Democrat, anti-interventionist, skeptical of parts of the national security consensus, publicly controversial over Russia, Snowden, and Syria, and precisely the kind of figure who could be portrayed as proving that the old intelligence and foreign policy class still wanted to police acceptable opinion through credentialing rituals it only called neutral after the fact. That is why this pair is so rich. Raskin believes the vetting ritual protects the republic. Gabbard's rise suggests that millions of Americans no longer trust the keepers of the ritual, and once those two things collide, the nomination becomes much bigger than one office. Now, to understand why the clash gains so much symbolic power, you have to remember what Gabbard already meant by late 2024 and early 2025. She was not simply another Trump appointee. She was one of the most narratively complicated figures in national politics. A former Democratic congresswoman turned Trump-aligned national security nominee, a critic of forever wars, who had also drawn fierce criticism for comments about Russia and for defending Edward Snowden in ways many intelligence hawks considered reckless. A politician whose career had already become a long-running argument over whether dissent from the security establishment is principled independence or dangerous naivete. Reuters captured that tension directly when it reported that Gabbard faced a rough confirmation path because of her past defense of Snowden and comments perceived as supportive of Russia, before later noting that she still advanced and headed toward confirmation as Republicans close ranks behind even their most controversial nominees. That is where Raskin enters the story with real force, because Raskin is almost a mirror image institutional symbol. He is constitutionalist, legalistic, process-oriented, and deeply identified with the idea that democratic systems survive only if power is constrained by principled norms and transparent procedures. Where Gabbard often speaks in the language of anti-establishment rupture, Raskin speaks in the language of democratic guardrails. He does not want the republic governed by improvisation, vibes, or revenge against elite consensus. He wants procedures strong enough that trust can outlive one administration or one political mood. That is why his demand for FBI vetting was not minor paperwork chatter. It was a declaration that the process itself was part of the battle. And that declaration matters because by the time Trump returned to office, large parts of the country were already primed to interpret procedural insistence in two opposite ways. One side heard process as prudence. The other heard process as sabotage. That split sits at the center of the Gabbard-Raskin confrontation. Raskin says, if you want to hand a person extraordinary access to intelligence, national secrets, and the machinery of state judgment, the country has a right to expect full scrutiny, regular procedure, and institutional seriousness. What did the Gabbard coalition hears? The same establishment that distrusted her politics from the start is once again trying to use procedural language to box out a dissident figure before she can enter the room. That is why the confrontation cannot be settled by saying, background checks are normal. Of course they are. The fight is over whether normality itself is still trusted when the people invoking it are associated, in the minds of millions, with a national security establishment that has lost democratic credibility. This is the deeper American problem the pair exposes. How do you defend the necessity of institutional vetting in a country where millions increasingly believe institutions use vetting to preserve ideological boundaries rather than merely screen for competence and risk? Raskin's answer is that abandoning or weakening those norms is precisely how democracies slide into personalized rule, impulsive appointments, and dangerous concentration of power. Gabbard's broader symbolic answer is that the norms themselves have too often been enforced selectively, and that invoking them against someone like her sounds less like neutral protection and more like boundary control by a class that already decided what kinds of dissent are too unsettling to entrust. That is why the confirmation fight became bigger than Gabbard's dossier. It became a struggle over who gets to define danger. Is the danger that an unorthodox, anti-establishment intelligence chief might bring suspect judgment and unusual loyalties into a highly sensitive post? Or is the danger that the same institutional actors who presided over years of foreign policy and intelligence failures now want to use trust language to stop an outsider from entering their domain? Raskin answers one way. Gabbard's movement answers the other. And because each answer feeds on the public's prior distrust, the confrontation becomes very difficult to unwind. This is also why Gabbard is such a fascinating target for constitutional proceduralists. She is not easy to attack cleanly without proving her point. If you overreach, you sound like you are punishing her for ideological independence. If you speak too softly, you fail to communicate what you regard as the real stakes of putting a controversial and unusually disruptive figure in charge of intelligence coordination. The balance is hard. Raskin's vetting argument is one of the smarter ways to navigate that problem because it focuses less on personal denunciation and more on systemic obligation. But even that approach has limits, because once process itself becomes politicized, every procedural demand can be retranslated by the other side as evidence of fear. That is the trap, and it is why the Gabbard nomination became such a revealing Democratic episode. It was not only a test of whether senators liked or disliked her. It was a test of whether the country still believes procedures can carry legitimacy independent of the factions deploying them. Raskin wanted the answer to be yes. The Trump-Gabbard coalition wanted the public to feel that such procedures were either being weaponized or, at the very least, selectively brandished against outsiders in ways insiders never fully endure. That feeling is powerful because it draws from real frustration. Many Americans do not trust the post-Cold War foreign policy and intelligence class. They blame it for wars, secrecy, groupthink, and repeated moral arrogance. Gabbard's rise cannot be understood apart from that distrust. She is attractive to many people precisely because she seems willing to offend the class that speaks most confidently about protecting the system. That is why a demand like Raskin's, however defensible on the merits, lands in a polarized environment as something far more charged than a civics lecture. And yet the opposite danger is just as real. A democracy that treats every institutional safeguard as optional once a movement distrusts the institution is a democracy heading toward rule by pure appetite. If a nominee's exceptional access to secrets and national security machinery is no longer understood to require exceptional scrutiny, then the line between democratic appointment and personalist capture starts to blur. That is the warning inside Raskin's position. He is not simply saying, follow the checklist. He is saying that the checklist exists because republics cannot rely on charisma, defiance, or partisan confidence to decide who should hold sensitive power. That is a serious warning, and it becomes more serious when placed against Reuters reporting that even some Republicans were at first reluctant about Gabbard's nomination before the party moved into alignment. And that movement toward alignment matters because it shows how quickly concerns that initially sound substantive can get absorbed into a larger loyalty dynamic. Once that happens, vetting questions become politically dangerous, not only for the nominee, but for anyone inside the coalition who continues to raise them. Raskin, being outside the coalition, can keep raising them, but that also makes it easier for supporters to dismiss him as partisan. Again, the structure is self-reinforcing. That is why this confrontation belongs in long-form analysis rather than short-form shouting. It is not about one gotcha. It is about a democratic system no longer enjoying common faith in the procedures designed to make dangerous appointments less dangerous. And Gabbard herself intensifies that problem because she is such a good anti-establishment symbol. She has the biography of someone who crossed lines, rejected orthodoxies, and paid costs for it. That makes attacks on her feel, to her supporters, like renewed proof that the establishment never forgives serious dissent. Even when the attacks are procedural, they are received as ideological. That is a massive advantage in the modern political environment. Raskin knows all this. He knows that saying, "Run the normal FBI check" will be heard by millions not as common sense, but as coded panic from the old order. But he says it anyway because his entire political identity is built on the belief that norms only survive if somebody is willing to look boring and insistent in moments when the culture wants spectacle. And that is what makes the pair dramatically strong. Gabbard represents the glamour of rupture. Raskin represents the stubbornness of guardrails. Neither can abandon that role without giving up the thing that makes them legible to their audience. And that is why the clash keeps echoing beyond the formal nomination process. It asks a question the country still has not answered. When trust in the establishment collapses, what is the democratic future of establishment procedures? Do they remain binding because the republic needs them? Or do they become optional because too many people now experience them as instruments of class and ideological control? Raskin says the first answer must prevail, or the system degrades. Gabbard's rise depends on the second answer becoming at least emotionally plausible. That is why their confrontation matters. Not because they staged some perfect viral face-off, but because together they reveal one of the deepest problems in American politics now. The people most committed to procedural safeguards often speak from institutions many voters distrust, and the people most effective at channeling that distrust often make it harder for safeguards to retain their moral force. That is not a small problem. It is one of the central constitutional problems of the era. And that is why the Tulsi Gabbard and Jamie Raskin pairing deserves this kind of treatment. It is a case study in how democracies fight over the legitimacy of the very tools they once assumed everyone wanted to preserve. Raskin used the language of vetting to defend the system. Gabbard's political momentum turned the same language into something many people heard as proof of why the system no longer deserves blind faith. The nomination moved forward. The distrust remained. And that may be the real ending here. Not victory for one side or the other, but the confirmation that America now has an enormous argument on its hands about whether procedural seriousness is still a shared good or just one more partisan dialect spoken by people whose authority millions no longer recognize. That is the real Raskin-Gabbard conflict, and it is only going to grow more relevant from here. There is another reason the Gabbard-Raskin confrontation matters so much. It sits exactly at the place where the politics of anti-establishment charisma collides with the politics of constitutional maintenance. Those two politics often sound abstract until a nomination concentrates them. Then the difference becomes brutally concrete. Tulsi Gabbard's political appeal, especially to people disillusioned with both parties, has long depended on the idea that she is willing to say what institutional actors are too scripted, too fearful, or too captured to say. She presents herself as someone who has crossed tribal lines, paid a price for it, and therefore deserves a hearing unavailable to more conventional officials. That is a powerful appeal in an age when millions of people feel that official vetting processes produce safe failures more reliably than they produce brave truth-tellers. Jamie Raskin's appeal moves in the opposite direction. Well, he represents the belief that democracies only survive if enough people are still willing to look procedural when the culture wants drama. He is persuasive to audiences who fear not merely bad appointments, but the erosion of the habits that once made bad appointments harder to force through. He sounds less romantic, less insurgent, less mythic. But that is precisely his point. Constitutional systems are supposed to frustrate charisma when charisma is asking for extraordinary trust. That is why the background check fight was so symbolically important. It put those two worldviews into direct conflict without requiring a single theatrical face-off. Raskin was saying, before this person touches the crown jewels of the intelligence system, we should insist on ordinary but meaningful protections. Gabbard's rise was saying, the people who call those protections ordinary are the same people many citizens no longer trust to define normality. That is not a paperwork dispute. That is a democratic legitimacy dispute. And it becomes even sharper because intelligence work depends more than most realms of government on trust that the public cannot directly verify. Citizens do not get to see everything. They do not get to audit every briefing, every classification decision, every internal debate. They must therefore trust the process by which those entrusted with secrets are vetted and selected. Raskin's alarm emerges from that fact. If the public cannot observe the work directly, then the integrity of the gatekeeping process becomes even more important. But that same hiddenness is exactly why anti-establishment figures like Gabbard can be so powerful in this arena. Hidden systems invite suspicion. Secretive cultures invite rebellion. National security expertise often sounds to critics like a self-sealing language designed to protect the people already inside the circle. Gabbard, by biography and by style, offers herself as an interruption to that circle. That is why the confrontation is bigger than either of them. It stages one of the deepest paradoxes of modern democracy. The more important an institution is, the more it relies on public trust, but the more secretive it is, the harder that trust becomes to sustain. And the harder that trust becomes to sustain, the more attractive anti-establishment nominees become to people who believe the guardians of the institution have failed too often to retain automatic deference. Raskin responds to that paradox by doubling down on norms. Gabbard responds by embodying the revolt against automatic deference. Neither response is going away. That is why this pair deserves long-form treatment. It previews many future fights, not only over intelligence chiefs, but over judges, prosecutors, military leaders, regulators, and any official whose power depends in part on the public trusting a process the public can barely see. Raskin's warning is that once you let distrust of institutions become a reason to weaken safeguards, the institutions do not become more democratic. They become easier for factional power to colonize. Gabbard's symbolic answer is that if the same distrusted institutions remain fully in charge of deciding who counts as safe, trustworthy, or responsible, then anti-establishment correction never arrives and the gatekeepers simply reproduce themselves forever. That is a profound democratic tension, and it is one reason the confrontation has emotional depth even without a single dominant viral clip. People on each side feel they are defending the republic against a different version of capture. Raskin fears capture from above by a movement that wants loyalists, spectacle, and loosened standards. Gabbard's coalition fears capture from within by an entrenched class that treats dissent itself as risk and uses standards as a neutral-sounding language for exclusion. That is why the fight over vetting is not boring at all. It is a fight over whether the word qualified still has shared meaning. In one political world, qualified means tested, scrutinized, procedurally cleared, institutionally legible. In the other, qualified increasingly sounds like socially approved by the same failed class that produced endless war, strategic drift, secrecy, and moral arrogance. Raskin speaks for the first world. Gabbard's rise depends on the second world existing, and this is where the drama becomes especially sharp, because neither side is entirely wrong to identify a danger. The intelligence and foreign policy establishment has made catastrophic errors. It has often sounded self-protective, closed, and smug. Public distrust did not arise from nowhere. But it is also true that a politics of pure disruption can end by weakening the very filters that protect democracies from turning sensitive institutions into factional weapons. The country is not choosing between one perfectly healthy option and one diseased one. It is choosing between two partially true fears. That is why the script should resist cheap simplification. Raskin is not merely a bureaucratic scold terrified of outsiders. Gabbard is not merely a heroic dissident unfairly hounded by elites. The conflict matters because both figures tap into real democratic anxieties. Raskin channels the fear that the republic is losing its immune system. Gabbard channels the fear that the immune system has become indistinguishable from the disease it claims to prevent. That is a powerful pair. And it gets even more powerful when you remember how the nomination actually unfolded. Gabbard's critics emphasized her past comments, foreign policy judgments, and lack of intelligence experience. Reuters noted that she faced harsh questioning and a rough confirmation path before Republicans ultimately lined up behind her and pushed her through. That sequence matters because it shows how fast concerns can move from serious public obstacle to tribal test. Once the coalition decides the nominee must survive, each criticism begins to sound less like scrutiny and more like another enemy weapon. Raskin's procedural interventions, however reasonable on paper, were inevitably caught in that retranslation. That is why the confrontation did not end when the nomination advanced. It simply revealed more clearly how much institutional trust had already eroded. The process occurred, the warnings were issued, the votes moved, but the underlying democratic question remained unresolved. Did the system prove its resilience by still debating and vetting a controversial nominee? Or did it prove its fragility by showing how little those warnings matter once polarization converts every safeguard into another front of partisan warfare? That question is the real endpoint of the Gabbard-Raskin story. Not who won in the narrow sense, but what the episode taught the country about the future of procedural legitimacy itself. If every safeguard can be reframed as elite panic, then guardrails weaken. If every unconventional nominee is automatically framed as a threat in the name of norms, and then large parts of the public conclude the norms were never genuinely neutral, this means the conflict is not self-correcting. Each side's strongest move reinforces the other side's fear. Raskin's insistence on vetting confirms the suspicion that the gatekeepers are afraid. Gabbard's rise confirms the suspicion that the gatekeepers were right to worry. That is the self-tightening loop of democratic mistrust. It is why the story matters beyond one administration and beyond one woman. The pair, in other words, reveals a constitutional dilemma the country is going to live with for a long time. How do you preserve trust in the procedures of hidden institutions after the public has lost faith in the people who once administered those procedures without much resistance? Raskin's answer is to defend the procedures more explicitly. And Gabbard's political meaning is that millions now hear explicit procedural defense as the language of a class trying to keep its monopoly on seriousness. That is why their confrontation belongs in the long arc of the era. It is not an isolated nomination story. It is a chapter in the slow war over whether democratic systems can still command respect as systems, or whether every major appointment battle will now be experienced primarily as a struggle between insurgency and a distrusted administrative class. And that is why it still echoes. The nomination may have moved on, the offices may have changed hands, but the question Raskin raised and the political force Gabbard embodied remain very much alive. The next version of this fight is already on its way. This pair just made the stakes impossible to miss.